The key slid into the lock, and nothing happened. I stood on the front porch of my own home, the home I'd lived in for 31 years, and turned that key 3 times before I finally understood. The lock had been changed. I could hear voices inside. Movement, the scrape of furniture across hardwood floors I had laid with my own hands in the summer of 1993. I didn't knock. I didn't shout. I just stood there in the October cold, my breath fogging in the air, and I smiled. Then I pulled out my phone and typed a message to my lawyer. They changed the locks. We're ready. File everything. I put the phone back in my pocket, walked back to my rental car, not my truck, and I'll explain why in a moment, and drove to the Tim Hortons 3 blocks away. I ordered a medium double-double, sat by the window, and waited for my phone to ring. It took 11 minutes. That moment had been 14 months in the making. My name is Walter Greer. I'm 67 years old, and I spent 38 years as a civil engineer with the city of Edmonton. I'm not a dramatic man. I don't like confrontation. I've always believed that if you do good work and treat people honestly, things have a way of working themselves out. My late wife Patricia believed the same thing. She used to say, "Walter, the world has enough noise. You don't need to add to it." Patricia passed away in March of 2022, after 18 months of fighting pancreatic cancer, with more grace and quiet courage than I have ever witnessed in another human being. She was 63 years old. We had been married for 41 years. Our house on Ravine Drive, in the west end of Edmonton, was hers as much as mine. More, really. She was the one who found it. She was the one who fought to get the price down $40,000 when the market was hot. She planted the gardens along the back fence, every spring, even in the last year when she could barely bend down. She chose the color of every wall. She knew where the afternoon light fell in January and where to put your chair if you wanted to read without straining your eyes. After she was gone, the house was the last place I still felt close to her. I had 2 children, a daughter, Renata, who is 41 and lives in Calgary with her husband and 2 kids, and a son, David, who is 38 and lives here in Edmonton, about 20 minutes from me. For the first year after Patricia died, both of them were wonderful. They called, they visited. David would come over on weekends, and we'd watch hockey or work on the truck together. Renata would come up from Calgary every month or 2, and we'd cook together, the way she and her mother used to. Those were hard months, but I wasn't alone in them, and that mattered more than I can say. The change in David started slowly. So slowly I almost didn't notice it at first. It was the spring of 2023, maybe 14 months after Patricia passed, when the comments started. Small things. Observations, he called them. "Dad, this yard is getting to be a lot for one person to manage." "Dad, have you thought about whether you really need 4 bedrooms?" "Dad, the stairs here, I mean. You're not getting any younger." I was 65 years old and in excellent health. I hiked every weekend. I still played recreational hockey on Tuesday nights at a rink in Sherwood Park. I had not once tripped on those stairs. But I let the comments go because David had always been the more anxious of my 2 kids, always the one who worried, and I thought he was processing grief in his own way. Then his partner, a man named Kyle, started joining these conversations. Kyle was 35, worked in real estate, and had a manner I can only describe as relentlessly cheerful in a way that never quite reached his eyes. I had nothing against Kyle personally, but I noticed that whenever Kyle was present, the conversations about the house became more specific, more pointed. "You know, Dad, a place like this in this neighborhood you're sitting on, serious equity. Properties on Ravine Drive are moving fast right now. If you were ever thinking of downsizing, now would be the time. I know a developer who's been looking in this area, just as a conversation, no pressure." I always changed the subject. I wasn't interested in selling. I had told both my children this plainly after Patricia died. The house was paid off. My pension from the city and my CPP were more than enough to live on. I did not need to liquidate my home to fund a retirement I was already managing comfortably. But by the fall of 2023, the conversations had shifted from suggestions to something else. David began asking me questions about things I'd supposedly forgotten. Had I left the stove on last Tuesday? He'd driven by and smelled something. Had I forgotten about his birthday dinner? I was there. I had made the reservation myself, but he'd mentioned it to his cousin, and apparently I'd told her I didn't know about it. Small incidents, vague and impossible to disprove. Then he started mentioning doctors. Dad, I really think you should see someone. Not because anything's wrong, just to establish a baseline. There's a geriatric specialist at the U of A. I can make the appointment. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Kyle's dad went through something similar. It started exactly like this. I want to be precise about how this felt, because I think it's important. It felt like standing in a room where the walls are moving inward by half an inch a day. You can't point to the moment it happened. You just notice, one morning, that you can't stretch your arms out as far as you used to. I mentioned it to Renata on the phone in November. She was quiet for a moment and then said, David called me too, Dad. He's worried. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to just go talk to someone. That was when I understood this was not one person's anxiety. This was a coordinated effort, and the target was my home. I did not panic. I want to be clear about that. I was angry, yes, deeply. Quietly angry in the way that Patricia always said was more dangerous than my occasional flares of temper. But I didn't confront David. I didn't call Renata back and tell her what I suspected. I did something much more useful. I called a lawyer. Her name is Sandra Holbrook, and she works out of a firm on Jasper Avenue that specializes in estate and elder law. A colleague from my years at the city had used her when his brother tried to contest their mother's will, and he said she was the sharpest person in any room she walked into. He was not exaggerating. I sat in Sandra's office on a Tuesday afternoon in late November 2023 and told her everything. The comments about the house, the questions about my memory, the geriatric specialist, the real estate developer Kyle apparently knew. She listened without interrupting, and when I was done, she folded her hands on the desk and said, Mr. Greer, I'm glad you came to me now rather than after. She explained several things I hadn't fully understood before that conversation. A power of attorney which I had signed years ago naming David as my primary agent could, in the wrong circumstances, and with enough manufactured evidence of incapacity, be invoked to allow him to make financial decisions on my behalf, including real estate transactions. It was not supposed to work that way. It was a springing POA, meaning it could only be activated if I was declared mentally incapacitated by a physician. But Sandra had seen cases where that threshold was approached through a combination of pressure, selective documentation, and cooperative medical professionals. She was not accusing David of anything, not yet, but she recommended we take steps. Over the next 3 weeks, I did the following things, all quietly and without telling anyone in my family. I visited my family physician and requested a full cognitive assessment, not because I had any concerns, but because I wanted an official, documented, dated record of my mental acuity. I scored in the 93rd percentile for my age group. My doctor noted in writing that there was no clinical basis for any concern about my decision-making capacity. Sandra received a copy of that report. I established a revocable living trust and transferred the property on Ravine Drive into it. The trust named me as the trustee and primary beneficiary during my lifetime, with clear successor provisions. Crucially, the trust structure meant that even a valid POA would not give David authority over the property. The house was no longer held in my personal name in the way he believed. I also had Sandra prepare a new, limited POA that replaced the old one. The new document explicitly excluded real estate transactions and financial accounts above a nominal amount. David did not know about this change. I installed a security camera system at the house, 4 exterior cameras, 1 interior camera in the front hallway, all feeding to a cloud account that David had no access to. I also began keeping a written log detailed of every conversation in which the house or my cognitive health was mentioned. And I did one more thing, which I will come back to. Sandra looked over everything in early January 2024 and said, "You're well protected now. If someone tries to move on this property without your knowledge or consent, they'll find a wall they didn't know was there." I thanked her and went home and sat in Patricia's chair by the window for a long time. The spring of 2024 was almost normal. David backed off the memory comments, perhaps because I had started responding to them with cheerful specificity, dates, details, names, times that made it hard to maintain the narrative. He still came over. We still watched hockey. But there was something different in how he looked at me sometimes. A calculation I recognize now that I knew to look for it. In April, Renata called and apologized. She said she'd thought about it more and felt she'd been too quick to take David's side. I told her I appreciated that. I did not tell her what I'd set in motion. In May, Kyle mentioned the developer again. I said I wasn't interested and suggested we talk about something else. Kyle smiled that smile of his and said, of course, whenever you're ready. I had begun to understand that they were waiting for something specific. They weren't going to move until they had the medical documentation they needed, or believed they had it. What I didn't know yet was how far David was willing to go to get it. I found out in June. David called me on a Wednesday evening and told me he'd arranged for me to see a specialist, a geriatric neurologist, at a clinic in Calgary. He had already booked the appointment. He said he and Kyle would drive me down, we'd make a weekend of it, see Renata and the grandchildren. He said the doctor came highly recommended. I asked who had recommended him. David said a friend of Kyle's, someone who worked in the field. I said I'd think about it. I called Sandra the next morning. She made some inquiries and called me back that afternoon. The clinic David had named was legitimate. The doctor was real. But he was also known, within certain professional circles, to have a flexible approach to capacity assessments, meaning he had, on more than one occasion, produced documentation that did not fully reflect the clinical picture of the patient he'd examined. I never went to that appointment. What I did instead was go to my own physician again, with Sandra present, and have a second, fully documented cognitive evaluation performed on the same date David believed I was traveling to Calgary for the first one. I told David I'd decided to go on my own and that the appointment had gone fine. I said the doctor had found nothing concerning. David sounded disappointed in a way he tried to hide. The trap, when we said it, was Sandra's idea more than mine, but I agreed to every part of it. In late July 2024, I told David I was planning a trip. An old engineering colleague of mine, a man named Frank Okafor, had retired to Prince Edward Island, and I'd been meaning to visit for years. I said I was going for 2 weeks in September. I asked David if he'd mind keeping an eye on the house. He said, of course, Dad, no problem at all. I asked him if he still had the spare key I'd given him years ago for emergencies. He said yes, he did. Good, I said. I'll leave the truck in the driveway so the neighbors don't think the place is empty. On the 7th of September, I drove to the Edmonton airport in my truck, parked it in the long-term lot, and took a cab back to a hotel near the university where I had booked a room under a slightly different version of my name, Walter G. Greer, instead of Walter James Greer. I was not going to PEI. Frank Okafor is a real person and a real friend, but I was not visiting him that September. I had told him I might be in touch with a strange request, and he had laughed and said, Walter, after 30 years, I expect nothing less. I stayed in Edmonton. I watched the cameras. On the third day, David and Kyle came to the house. They did not come to check on things. They came with Kyle's colleague from the real estate office, a woman I'd met once at a Christmas party, and they walked through every room with clipboards. I watched it on my phone from my hotel room. They measured the kitchen. They opened closets. Kyle's colleague photographed the back garden, Patricia's garden, from 3 different angles. They were there for 2 hours and 20 minutes. I called Sandra that evening and told her what I'd seen. She said, good, keep watching. On the 14th of September, 1 week later, a document was filed with a provincial registry attempting to transfer the property on Ravine Drive using my power of attorney. The name on the authorization was mine. The signature was not. Sandra had been monitoring for exactly this. She called me within an hour of the filing. The transfer failed. Because the house was in the trust, the POA had no authority over it. The filing bounced back, flagged as invalid. But the attempt had been made, the document had been created, and it had my forged signature on it. That was everything Sandra needed. I came home on the 21st of September. I drove my rental car, not my truck. I'd arranged for a friend to drive my truck back from the airport lot the week before, so that when David checked, it would appear I was still away. I parked the rental down the street. When I walked up to my front door and put my key in the lock and found it didn't work, I was not surprised. I had expected it. But standing there, actually feeling the key fail to turn, something cold moved through me anyway. Not fear, not grief exactly, just the full weight of what my son had done. I stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then I did what I'd planned to do. I smiled, because it was over, and because they had walked directly into every part of what we'd prepared. Then I took out my phone and sent Sandra the message she'd been waiting for. They changed the locks. We're ready. File everything. I walked back to the rental car, drove to the Tim Hortons on 149th Street, and ordered a double-double. My hands were steady. I was 67 years old and my son had tried to steal my home, and I had been ready for him for 14 months, and now it was done. Sandra called 11 minutes later. She said, "The injunction is filed. The forged POA document has been forwarded to the RCMP, and I've served notice on the two individuals currently in possession of the property that they are trespassing on a trust asset and must vacate within 24 hours or face enforcement." I asked her if it would hold. She said, "Walter, they forged your signature on a legal document and attempted a fraudulent property transfer. It's going to hold." David called me that evening. I let it go to voicemail. He called again and again. At 11 o'clock that night, he showed up at the hotel. I don't know how he found me. I assume he called around and knocked on my door and said, "Dad, I can explain." I opened the door. I looked at my son. He was 38 years old, and he looked, in that moment, like a child who had broken something irreplaceable and knew it. I said, "I know you can. You'll have the opportunity to explain it to the RCMP." Then I closed the door. That was the last time I spoke to David directly for almost a year. His lawyer spoke to Sandra. My sister spoke to Renata, who had known nothing about what David had done and was, by all accounts, devastated. Kyle retained his own counsel separately. The legal process took 8 months. I won't detail all of it here, because much of it is still the subject of ongoing proceedings. What I can tell you is that the fraudulent POA document was determined to have been signed with a forged signature, that the property transfer attempt was found to have been made without my knowledge or consent, and that David and Kyle faced serious consequences as a result. Kyle's real estate license is under review. David's consequences are his own to live with. The locks on my house, the house and the trust on Ravine Drive were changed back. I moved back home in late October. The first thing I did was walk through every room. The furniture had been partially rearranged, and some of Patricia's things had been moved, which was harder to see than I expected. I spent an afternoon putting things back where they belonged. Then I went out to the back garden, even though it was late October and everything had gone dormant, and I stood at the fence where Patricia planted her roses every spring, and I stayed there for a while. I want to tell you about the one other thing I did during those 14 months of preparation, the thing I mentioned earlier and set aside. In December of 2023, just after I established the trust and had the cognitive assessment done, I started building something. In my garage, on the workbench where Patricia's father's tools have hung since he gave them to me in 1987, I began building a rocking chair. I am not a skilled woodworker. I have patience and decent hands, but no training. I found plans online and printed them out and followed them step by step. It took me the better part of 4 months. I made mistakes and corrected them. I sanded things down and started over twice on the back spindles. I finished it in April 2024, while David and Kyle were still circling. I put it on the back porch, in the corner where the afternoon light falls best in early spring, and I sat in it and looked at Patricia's garden, which was just beginning to come up. I had made it for her, I suppose, or made it for the version of myself that had the presence of mind to plan rather than panic. I'm not sure those are different things. I'm sitting in it now as I tell you this story. It's a Tuesday evening in June 2025. The roses came back this spring, which they've done every year, even without anyone helping them. I have thought a long time about what I want to say to people who might find themselves where I was not in the dramatic part, not the forged documents and the failed transfer, but in the earlier part, the part where the walls are moving half an inch a day and you can't quite prove it. Here is what I know. Your instincts are worth trusting, even when someone you love is the one making you doubt them. The first time I felt that cold calculation in David's eyes, I filed it away as uncharitable. I spent months dismissing my own read of the situation because he was my son and I wanted to believe I was wrong. I wasn't wrong, and every month I waited was a month they had to build the case they needed. The most important thing I did was talk to a professional before anything happened, not after, not when I was already in crisis. Sandra was able to help me because I came to her while I still had all my options open. The trust, the new POA, the cognitive documentation, none of that would have been available to me after the fact. Document everything. Write down dates, times, what was said, who was present. It feels strange to do this with your own family. It is strange. But a contemporaneous written record has legal weight that memory alone does not. Tell someone you trust, who is outside the immediate situation. I should have told Frank earlier. I should have told my sister. Isolation is part of how these situations work. The person being targeted often protects the family's reputation at the expense of their own protection. I did that. I paid for it in months of unnecessary anxiety. And this, if someone you love begins suggesting that your memory or your judgment is failing, and your own experience tells you that it is not, please get a formal assessment done immediately and have the documentation kept somewhere they cannot access it. Not because you're paranoid, because you deserve to have your own clarity on record, in your own words, before anyone else starts writing the narrative about who you are. I am 67 years old. I live alone in a house I have loved for 31 years. I manage my own finances, my own yard, my own health, my own life. I made one very large mistake, which was trusting that love is always a good reason to leave yourself unprotected. Love and trustworthiness are not the same thing. I wish someone had told me that 40 years ago. I'm telling you now. The roses bloom every June, whether anyone plants them or not. Some things are more resilient than the people who try to uproot them. I found that to be true of more than just gardens.